Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to support our Mexican staff. Your donation can be made at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. As you can see from the screen, our topic today is what is fueling climate change. And we have, this is obviously an issue of pressing importance to us all and of growing public interest, especially now in the lead up to COP26, starting the end of this week in Glasgow. There's a real challenge and a real question as to whether the world's leaders will be able to rise to the challenge. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last month issued a frightening report about the seriousness of the problem. And the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, called that report on the climate crisis a code red for humanity. We are at the verge of the abyss, he said. Well, if Patrick, you could take down that screen. Let me introduce our speakers. We have an international panel today. Our first speaker is from Canada, Paul Snelgrove, an oceanographer. He will be followed by Manuel Pérez-Rocha from the Institute for Policy Studies. Then Lucia Bercina. Manuel is in Washington, D.C. Lucia is in Madrid, Spain. And then our fourth speaker, Patrick Bond, is in South Africa. And of course, I'm in Mexico. And so we really have an international gathering today. Let me start by introducing Paul Snelgrove. He's an oceanographer based in Newfoundland, and was very much involved in the world census of marine life, which was a huge undertaking of experts from some 80 different countries. They say census, that doesn't mean they were counting all the fish in the ocean, but rather inventorying the different species, and in the process discovered many new ones. Paul has published a book, The Discoveries of the Census of Marine Life, which is a very fascinating book. I commend to you, with lots of really very interesting pictures of marine life, as well as very informative text. So we're going to lead off with Paul, and I'll introduce the other speakers more extensively as their turn comes. But Paul, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Cliff. Can everyone see my slides there? Someone give me a thumbs up. All right.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so I want to talk about the ocean, and particularly the role of the ocean in climate change. It's actually quite a complex relationship, so I'll try and get through it in the 10 minutes or so that I'll be speaking to you. So there are two aspects of this to think about. First of all is the effect of climate change on the ocean, and certainly some of this will be very familiar to some of you. But what's less familiar, I think, to many people is the flip side of the story, which is the effect of the ocean on climate change. And so there's a bit of a feedback, a very significant feedback between the two, where certainly the role that the ocean has played in climate on this planet is immense. And if that role is lost or significantly changed, then we'd be in really, really serious trouble, not that we aren't already in trouble. And so one of the issues here is this large-scale ocean circulation feature called the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. And the importance of this feature is, as you can see these red arrows at the surface in the North Atlantic, they carry warm surface water towards the poles, and in doing that, they transfer heat. Now, the really critical thing that happens when it gets to the poles is that water sinks. And what it does when it sinks is it transports out large amounts of heat and carbon dioxide from the surface waters into the deep ocean. The reason that's important is that it can stay in the deep ocean for up to 1,000 years. And so it's a very important part of the carbon cycling story for this planet, and also for the heat cycling story for this planet. So it's a major CO2 sink and a major heat sink as well. There is concern, though, that this conveyor belt could fail, and there's already evidence that it has weakened. And so if that heat and CO2 removal service declines, then we could be in really quite serious trouble. And so this is a map showing you the distribution of carbon dioxide absorption in the ocean around the world. And what you see here on the upper right-hand side of the image is just off the part of the world that I live in Newfoundland, Canada, a major sinking location for water that carries with it a lot of carbon dioxide. And so again, very large scale removal, extremely large amounts of carbon dioxide that are transported out of the surface layers of the ocean. A key part of this process, first of all, is really a physical part, which is the water itself sinking out of those surface layers. But there's also the role that biology plays. And what you see here in the upper left-hand corner of the image is phytoplankton, the single-celled organisms that photosynthesize. They take up carbon dioxide and release oxygen, but then they're fed on by different organisms. They go on up the food chain. Along the way, some of them die and sink. The animals that feed on them die and sink, and they carry that carbon out of the surface layer again into the deep ocean. And so that's another key source of carbon dioxide removal and part of the carbon cycle on this planet. But the question then is, what happens when we change that biological pump? And so, for example, if we remove large amounts of fish, which we have already done, then that mechanism that helps to transport carbon out of the surface layers is lost, because it's been put back into play, back in the atmosphere, and contributing to climate change on the planet. So I want to first of all talk to you a little bit about the ocean as hero in this story. And what I mean by hero here is that the oceans have absorbed about 93% of the excess heat that we have put into the atmosphere through emissions and other industrial development since the last century or so. Had we not seen that absorption, that 93%, the planet would be an awful lot hotter than what it is right now. To illustrate this point, the upper 10 meters of the ocean contains more heat than all of the atmosphere combined. And that, of course, is just a tiny bit of the ocean. The second part of this story in the middle here is carbon dioxide. And the ocean has absorbed something like 30% of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. And so about a third of that has been taken up by the oceans at no cost to us. And so again, a real benefit. There's also the excess water that we've added. And I'm talking here about melting of glaciers, the fact that we've seen significant declines in those structures, and the ocean has absorbed 100% of that. So clearly, that's my idea of the ocean as hero. But this, of course, has caused ocean warming, it's caused acidification, and it's caused sea level rise. And we'll say a little bit about each of those. And so here's a schematic that shows you a warmer ocean. What you're seeing here is 1960 through 2016. The red areas are where we've seen the most striking increases. The blue areas, we've actually seen a little bit of cooling. But what you can see there is that generally we're a couple of degrees warmer than we were not so long ago. So some very serious rates of increase going on there. And here we see change in acidification. And so this is the pH, the amount of hydrogen ion that's dissolved in water. And what you see around the corner of this image is some of the different organisms that are affected by this change in pH. Even these very small changes in pH are having profound effects on primary producers, on species that have shells, such as lobster, that are vulnerable to changes in pH. And so some problems that we're seeing there. A third issue is one of a rising ocean. And so we are seeing an increase in the fact that the ocean is now encroaching on land more and more. Of course, that's a huge effect for humans, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but also a significant problem for ocean life, because in many cases, we as humans backstop the progression of those animals. They can't move further inward towards land as sea level increases, because we're there and stopping them from any sort of migration. So the ocean is martyr there. We see these increased CO2, the increased temperatures, and so we see shifting distributions, reduced ocean productivity, shell erosion of different species, and certainly loss of some species and habitat. And so we see effects on the planet, effects on the ocean, and then, of course, effects on ocean life. And so why does this matter to us as humans? Well, we see this vast array of ocean life, and Cliff mentioned I've been involved in a project that was looking at this diversity of life. And so this diversity feeds a whole variety of processes in the ocean, which in turn supports a whole bunch of services. And so these services, in fact, provide direct benefits to us as humans, human society, and that, of course, allows us to increase in numbers, and that, of course, has negative effects on biodiversity. You may not be able to see this image very well, but what I circled here, this is the human population since 10,000 BC. I've circled 3 billion in 1960. That's roughly when I was born. And you can see that global population has more than doubled just in my lifetime. And so we're putting a lot more pressure on the ocean, and obviously requiring a lot more ocean resources. And so what does this mean, all these changes that we see in the ocean in terms of human benefits? What you're seeing in the top image there is changes in catch potential. And so how much fishery can we extract from the ocean as we go forward? And I think this is a 50-year projection, if I remember correctly. And what you see is the areas in red are going to see serious declines. The areas in blue may actually see some benefits, although not necessarily the same species or the species of same value. What you may also see here is that generally wealthy countries in the lower left will do pretty well in this sad story, and less wealthy countries will do less well, and we'll certainly start to see declines in their fisheries. I will point out that 1 in 5 people globally depend on fish as their primary source of protein. You'll see that map there in the lower right. The dark blues are the countries that depend the most, and as you can see, they're also in the areas that are experiencing or will experience the most change in fisheries capture success. So in a nutshell, those who can afford it least will pay the most in terms of ocean benefits. Here's another example. I'm going to use some wealthy examples to illustrate a point. This is actually Hawaii. And what you're seeing here is a coral reef in the lower left-hand corner, and a very lucrative beach and resorts in the upper left-hand corner. And so the problem here is that coral reef provides a natural barrier. And as that barrier decreases with the loss of the reefs, we start to see coastal erosion and the loss of those beaches. And so the cost to ecotourism, of course, is likely to be very severe. And so what you're seeing there is in dollars per kilometer for the coast of Hawaii, along different regions of the Hawaiian coastline. The inset there shows you Florida. You can see that just from an ecotourism perspective, very substantial losses. Now, this is Costa Rica. What you're seeing here is the 100-year floodplain with the coral reef and without the coral reef. And clearly, you can see much more impact with the loss of coral reef systems and the natural barrier they provide for coastal protection. So I want to finish up just by discussing the idea of insurance. Many of us have homes and vehicles that we put insurance on, and some people even have pets that they insure. This is not my house or my car, but it is my pet. But what we don't do is insure nature. And so in the part of the world where I live, 1992, we did not have any really good degrees of protection for a species of cod that lives off the coast here. And we saw 30,000 people of a population of 500,000 thrown out of work overnight, literally, with the complete shutdown and collapse of the fishery. And so my point here is that without forms of insurance, the day of reckoning is going to come. I think it's already upon us in many cases, and we need to think about what we can do to try and take out some insurance as quickly as we can. One of the partial solutions, it's a complicated one, is marine protected areas of various types. What you see here is a current map of marine protected areas. This is actually a year or two old now. But globally, we've protected about 3.7% of the global ocean, and about 2% of the global ocean gets strong protection. Now, marine protected areas are complicated because there is loss of access and what that means. But in many cases, there can be strategies to try and balance that loss of access with enhanced fisheries that result from them, enhanced ecotourism, and other sorts of benefits. So in a nutshell, we have a lot to lose. We are losing quite a bit. And I'll pass it along now to my colleagues to talk about some of the socioeconomic issues associated with these various impacts. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Very informative, very. We will save questions and comments for the end after we've heard from each of our four speakers. So if you have anything you want to say to Paul, hold on to it for now. You'll have your chance later. Now we go to Manuel Pérez-Rocha. He is with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and he will be talking about trade agreements and their relevance for climate change. Manuel?
Thank you very much, Cliff, and thank you to the Center for Global Justice for this invitation. I'd like to talk about how discussions on what is fueling climate change must address urgently how the proliferation of almost 3,000 international investment agreements, both in the form of bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements, allow fossil fuel industries, as well as other extractive sectors like mining, to sue governments for billions, and how they undermine these agreements, the efforts of governments to make the kinds of public policy decisions necessary to transition away from fossil fuels. Transnational corporations have access to the supranational arbitration system known as Investor State Dispute Settlement, or is better known as ISDS for its acronym in English. These are contained in these free trade agreements and other investment protection laws. ISDS allow companies to bypass domestic courts and sue governments before private tribunals of highly paid corporate lawyers who have no obligation whatsoever to the environment or to the efforts to tackle climate change. The extractive sector takes the greatest advantage of the ISDS system, being oil, gas, and mining companies. Oil, gas, and mining companies, they bring about approximately 25% or a quarter of all the known claims at these tribunals. We have in IPS a report called Extraction Casino, in which we explain exactly how oil, gas, and mining companies gamble with the sovereignty of countries through supranational arbitration. And we examine how extractive industries have been filing dozens of multi-million-dollar claims, particularly in Latin America. But of course, these claims are against countries all over the world. And they demand compensation for court decisions, public policies, and other government measures that corporations claim reduce the value of their investments. In most of these cases, in many cases, communities have been actively organizing to resist mining oil and fracking activities and defend their land, their health, their environment, and ways of life. For communities resisting these corporate suits against their countries represent a further assault against their self-determination and the already limited protections that they have. No? And meanwhile, extractive industries, for them, supranational arbitration is yet another opportunity to strike through reckless, what we call casino-style gambling, given the recourse they have to bring suits within a system in which the deck is heavily stacked in their favor. So the ISDS system allows foreign investors, again, to bypass domestic courts and make claims for millions and even billions. And I will show some charts at the end because right now I'm not very sure how to share my screen. But it's important to know that the most important tribunal is the World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, is the most commonly used. And again, the so-called tribunals, they're made up of highly paid 3-person panels of corporate lawyers that operate behind doors. And it's been called a caricature of a legal system, really, because they don't have any regard to precedent or any regard to truth or real justice. So the investor protection rules that extractive industries most frequently invoke are indirect expropriation, which is especially egregious since it relates to so-called expropriation of anticipated future lost profits rather than the physical taking of property of investments. There's also fair and equitable treatment, which is also a clause commonly invoked, which is highly vague and subjective, and arbitrators have interpreted it in widely different ways without much regard to diverse histories, cultures, or value systems. There is even the full protection and security clause in these agreements, which imposes a duty on governments to do everything in their power to protect foreign investments from harm, supposed harm, alleged harm, whether from the state or non-state actors, such as communities defending their lands or their water. So all these investment protections create a regulatory chill, and this is what's most important for our discussion. It prevents governments from all around the world to take effective action to tackle climate change because of fear of being sued. So at the policy level, in the light of the threat that mining and other extractive industries pose to people and the environment, and in the interest of recuperating national sovereignty over policy making to protect the well-being of communities and to tackle climate change, only after we require really meaningful participation and either to cancel or rewrite the terms of free trade agreements and investment agreements and put people's rights and the environment first. So it is, necessary to restore the policy space for governments to pursue and prioritize local and national economies and also environmental protections, as well as the preservation, promotion, and restoration of public services. So there are opportunities to continue building international solidarity and demonstrate the abusiveness of the international investment regime. I would like to recall also lessons from the experience that we have in a campaign against an ISDS case. And this was the ISDS case brought Pacific Rim Mining Company, that it was brought against El Salvador in 2009 for not having granted a permit to put a gold mine into operation. And with the local, national, and international campaigning, the case was decided favorably to El Salvador. El Salvador was being sued for $300 million. But not only that, it pushed to the Salvadoran legislature to pass a ban on all metallic mining in the country. So it's the first country that bans metallic mining in the world. And this is a case of international solidarity being brought in a very effective way. So what is the alternative to all this regime? We need to include strong binding and enforceable obligations in all trade and investment agreements to address climate change, deforestation, contamination of air, water, as well as emissions of greenhouse gases, and to help preserve the social property at the national and local level of forests, lands, biodiversity, and water. Every country should be required to fulfill its nationally determined contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement without fearing to be sued by transnational corporations. So we need to link in all these discussions around climate change. I think it's very important in some to link all these discussions around climate change to the critique of free trade and investment agreements. Let me see if I can share my screen. Share screen. And here, just as a way of presentation, you can see how of all the cases, ISDS cases being brought to ICSID, the World Bank's tribunal, almost a quarter represent oil, gas, and mining companies. It's the majority. And you can see the explosion in this graph of ISDS cases since 1995 to today, to 2021, and how the majority of cases are decided in favor of the investor, because when cases are settled, they're also in favor of the investor. And let me see another graph. And of all the cases already decided in favor of the investor, extractive industries have claimed at least $195 billion. And the awards in the end have been for the sum of $73 billion. This is an enormous amount, which most countries in the world cannot even afford. And of the biggest cases, ISDS awards for more than 1 billion, 11 out of 14 pertain to extractive industries. So I'm just going to conclude here and just remark that it is very important that we bring these issues up during the Glasgow COP. Most probably governments will not even be discussing it, but I think as civil society organizations, we must take the opportunity to bring this to the light in the discussions around the next COP in Glasgow. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Manuel. ISDS is something that most people are not that familiar with, and even less so are they familiar with the impact on climate through their protection of fossil fuel and mining interests. Now we move to Spain to hear from Lucia Barcena, who is with the Transnational Institute, which is based in Amsterdam, but she speaks to us from Madrid, Spain, where she now lives. And she's going to tell us about something I had never heard of before, the Energy Charter Treaty. So take it away, Lucia.
Thank you, Cliff. Yeah, I am sure that not too many people have actually heard about the Energy Charter Treaty, but this is just one of the around 3,000 investment agreements that Manuel was talking about. So everything that Manuel was explaining about the contents of this agreement, this concrete treaty includes it all. Plus, what we're seeing is that it's one of the treaties that it's being used the most, especially by fossil fuel companies. And this makes sense because it's an investment agreement that was actually designed by and to protect fossil fuel investments. So I'm going to share my screen. This was just so all of you could see my face in full screen. There. Do you see full screen?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, So so the Energy Charter Treaty is an international trade and investment agreement to which already 53 countries are signatories, so have ratified the agreement. These are countries especially from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and very recently Jordania, Yemen have joined, and also Japan is part of the agreement, which is another big country. And besides these countries, also the EU is a signatory of the country as a whole. So this also makes it a bit more complicated when we are trying to lobby and campaign for the countries to exit this agreement. There are some countries in blue, which are the countries that have signed but have not ratified the agreement. This is Russia and Australia. And in fact, we just heard today the news that Australia has definitely stepped out of the whole process of joining the agreement. The reasons have not been given yet. They have said officially that they're not that interested anymore in being part of this treaty. But the truth is that it has also been costing them quite some money to be part of the treaty. So this might also be one of the main reasons that they have decided to withdraw. There's one country only in orange, which is Italy. And Italy withdrew from the agreement in 2016. So this actually proves that it's not difficult to exit the treaty. There's just a need for political will to be there, and the process is quite easy. So yes, it's possible to exit the agreement. And the countries in green are the countries that are in line of accession. So these are the countries that are thinking about joining the Energy Charter Treaty. To go a bit into the origin or the story of how this treaty was designed. So the ECT was signed in the 90s, in 1991, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. The aim of the treaty originally was to ensure the flow of investments in former Soviet countries, and also to ensure the supply of energy to Western European countries, especially gas from Russia or oil from Central Asia. So you can see in this picture, this is a picture of when the treaty was signed in The Hague. And there has been some documents leaked that actually show that European companies such as Shell, Total, BP have lobbied around the ECT to make sure that the treaty was, the content of the treaty was drafted as vaguely as possible in order to protect their investments of these countries in the post-Soviet countries. So this fits to what Manuel was explaining, right? There was in the 90s, there was a proliferation of investment agreements worldwide, whereas different to, the 60s, in the 90s, there was a tendency to give more and more protection to foreign investors, and in this concrete case, to fossil fuel investors. The goals of the treaty, just like really quickly. So it is important to note that since the 90s, the treaty has not changed a single comma of the content. So for example, we can imagine all the different COPs that have been taking place. We are now in COP26. So every year there's a revision of the agreements, right? So with this agreement, there has been no revision, however, of the content of the agreement. So it is said that it's already a very outdated agreement because of the provisions that it includes, right? So the objective of the agreements is the beginning was to protect foreign investors in the energy sector, which translate mostly into the protection of investments in fossil fuels. And how does it do this? The ECT includes many rules that grant protection for foreign investors, including fair and equitable treatment, most favored nation treatment, as well as compensation for losses and protection against expropriation, direct or indirect. And these are clauses that are in the treaty, but the problem is, how to interpret these clauses, right? Because what is a fair and equitable treatment to a fossil fuel company if we're talking about environmental law, for example. So the point is that this treaty not only includes a very vague protection of what is, meant to be protected for fossil fuel investors, but the way to solve any type of conflict that arises from an investor that is in a host country will be solved through a dispute resolution, so through investor to state dispute mechanism, which is what Manuel already advanced. These are, in a nutshell, some corporate tribunals. So it's a sort of parallel justice that allows foreign investors to, evitate or not go through domestic courts, but directly go to these international courts that in general are more biased to their interests, because they are there to protect the treaty, and the treaty is there to protect their investments. And whatever these courts say are of immediate application, so they are completely binding for the countries. And the way to solve the conflicts between investors and states are to give compensation to the companies. But we're talking about millions and millions of dollars of compensation, which we will see now. Another problem of the treaty is the broad definition of what an investor or an investment is. So, the treaty talks about all sources of energy, as well as any aspect related to the supply or construction of energy infrastructure. So we're talking about everything, basically. And although it talks about energy sector in general, the reality is that it is investments in fossil fuels, so oil, gas, and coal, that are highly protected under the ECT. As we have seen over the period of 2013 and 2018, 61% of investments protected under the ECT were fossil fuel investments. It is important just to note that the investment protection under the ECT does not include any type of binding environmental protection or climate action criteria or provision. The ISDS cases worldwide are exploding, as Manuel was saying, but it is under the Energy Charter Treaty that most of these cases are taking place, or at least it is the treaty that has given rise to more investor state claims only under one agreement. So until today, we know that there are 142 known claims brought by companies under the treaty. But because the proceedings sometimes may be kept in secret, the actual number could be actually more. So as you can see, during the initial years of the agreement, only 19 claims were raised, but it was between 2010 and 2019 that there was an explosion of 437% increase of cases. This may be due to many reasons, but what we are seeing is that a lot of these cases have to do with regulatory changes in countries in the EU member countries that go around regulating coal, oil, or gas companies. So there are conflicts now arising, and specifically under this sector. So who is suing? So yes, I already advanced. Up to 2012, as far as we have completed the data, 70% of all the known cases were directly related to conflicts around oil, gas, or coal. And around 90% of the claimants had as part of their portfolio or their business some project involved in dirty energy. So we're talking about, basically we're talking about 100% of the cases are companies involved somehow in dirty energy. So the costs of this, as I was saying, the ISDS mechanism, how it solves the conflicts is to make governments pay compensation, monetary compensation. And as far as we know, up to today, there has been agreed to pay more than 52 billion euros in damages from public funds. I'm talking about this money is coming from public funds. And if we compare this money, because sometimes we talk about numbers and it's a lot and we know it's a lot, but what does it actually mean? Well, 52 billion US dollars, sorry, I said euros before, actually it represents the annual investment needed to provide energy access to all those in the world who not have it. And this is a number that was given by the International Agency on Energy from 2017. And of course, all this money, where will it come from? It will come from the public budgets. So instead of spending money on the actual plans needed for energy transition, for, I don't know, recovery of the oceans, for anything that actually has to do with, saving the planet, it's going to go to pay those investors, which, as we have seen, are investors who are pretty much involved in the dirty energy business. But the costs are not only monetary, because we're also talking about, unto what extent can the Energy Charter Treaty affect the state's sovereignty in their right to regulate, and in particular in the energy sector, which is in fact one of the most regulated sector. So basically, we can see how the legislative capacity is being severely limited with the Energy Charter Treaty and any other investment agreement. And we are already, we are experiencing, I don't know in your countries, but for example, in Spain, there's now a huge issue going on around the energy prices. The prices are just rising, and the state is, actually taking response towards this. And that response might sometimes, go against the private profits of big companies. So those conflicts could actually give rise to new lawsuits under this agreement. So as long as we are part of this type of investment agreements, there will always be, it will always be like a huge instrument that big corporations are going to be using to, to threaten states to use this mechanism to ask for millions of dollars, or to just stop any type of legislation to pass. And there are already 2 cases. Well, there are many more cases, but I just wanted to put here 2 cases. In 2017, the multinational company Rockhopper sued Italy for denying a permit to construct a drilling platform in the Adriatic Sea. And it's asking over 350 million euros. This is 7 times more what the company actually invested in the exploration phase. And this is because the treaty also allows not to only ask for compensation of actual losses, but of future losses. Another case is RWE, which is a German company, one of the biggest electric companies in Germany, against the Netherlands. And basically because in 2019, the Netherlands approved a new law where part of the plans were to decarbonize the economy until 2030. And this, of course, meant less profits for this German company specifically. And so they initiated a lawsuit against the Netherlands, and that is not closed yet. But the fact that this can happen is what is worrisome, and not only monetary in the sense of who are we compensating with these agreements. We're compensating basically the polluters. We have seen recently how some companies like Exxon, for example, they have actually known since long time, since the 70s, that climate change was there and that their activities actually contributed to accelerate climate change. So why should these companies now be allowed to get any type of compensation for their activities, while on the contrary, they should be the ones that should be paying? But with these tribunals, these private tribunals, as I said at the beginning, they're always going to be biased in favor of the investors' protection. So as long as we're part of these agreements, they will be allowed to get some kind of compensation. And just to finish, this is an outdated treaty for many reasons, but as we have seen for years, and increasingly so, there is a global consensus on the climate emergency we're experiencing from the scientific community, institutions, and civil society. We know that in order to avoid the worst effects of climate catastrophe, we must basically put an end to coal, oil, and gas extraction. And this all means that there will be new laws in countries that are in line to Paris Agreement, or just laws that are in line to what the people want, or laws that are in line to protect the environment. And all of this could actually give rise in the future to many, many more lawsuits that are going to be initiated. And we are already seeing that the tendency is really going now to see, how can investors protect themselves from this type of policies. So this is what, why sometimes it's maybe not natural to see the logic between what does trade and investment have to do, and especially investment protection have to do with climate change, but it's precisely how these agreements are blocking any type of climate action that is the problem. And just to finish, although we know that trade and investment policies should not be disconnected from planetary boundaries, they are actually disconnected. And so one thing is what the agreements will come now from Glasgow, and the other thing is what, for example, the European Union's policy on trade is. And until now, the EU wants to basically expand this agreement to many more countries, and especially to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Of course, there's a geopolitical intention behind this, which has to do with securing natural resources that the EU is completely dependent on. So there is a big campaign I encourage all of you to follow, which is to ask for the countries to withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty and to stop the expansion to other countries. And maybe we can share the website so you can just follow the news more closely. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Lucia. And now we go to the global south, to South Africa, where we will hear from Patrick Bond, who is a geographer in Johannesburg, and he will be telling us about what South Africa is doing that is contributing to climate change and the global financial system. Let's see.
Good. I think if Lucia can stop sharing, I can jump on. Thank you very, very much for having me, dear comrades, dear friends. And I think what I'll do is continue with this tradition of working against corporate power that we've had from Lucia and Manuel, and also pick up the big picture of mega ecological crisis. That was terrifying what Paul told us about the ocean. And to the question that Cliff has posed, I'll answer that it's really, it's capitalism, but we're going to be a little bit more specific about the irresponsibility of polluters when failing to acknowledge, in fact, rejecting their overdue climate debt. And I'll do that from my base here in Johannesburg, University of Johannesburg Department of Sociology, by first just reminding that we do have a precedent for solving a major ecological crisis at the multilateral scale. But then I'll ask whether Glasgow is going to reproduce some of the flaws in the Paris Agreement, what lessons we have from climate finance, and then what can we talk about in terms of reparations as a North-South and also present to future generation solidarity system in 15 minutes. So, okay, we've hosted in this city one of the worst instances of corporate takeover of the United Nations, the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. It was Rio +10. And it's where we began to really fear corporate interests, especially in water privatization, and let me call it the privatization of the air, carbon trading, the right to pollute if you buy somebody else's right to pollute. So we found all the phraseology with sustainable development totally distorted and co-opted. The activists here, especially Soweto, did beat back water privatization in Johannesburg after about 5 years of a very intense struggle. But we haven't done as well with carbon markets, as I'll show you. So the WSSD, unfortunately, it came 15 years after something that we do respect. We certainly have to look at the global climate crisis as a global governance problem. It has to be addressed at that scale ultimately, even though I'll argue the balance of forces aren't what they were in 1987 when another crisis, the one you see here, the expanding ozone hole, was coming from chlorofluorocarbon emissions. And the solution in 1987 was the Montreal Protocol that banned CFC production, phased it out, but after 1996 banned it. And that wasn't any cap and trade or market strategy. It was a state ban. And what it did was to stop that growth of the ozone hole and lower the amount of ozone in the atmosphere. So that's I think by all accounts, a good precedent. Instead, on the climate crisis, we've got, especially in Paris, but some of the precedents are interesting. We've got a real catastrophe because there were mandates, in a sense, from society, certainly from our climate justice movement, that the greenhouse gases had to be cut in an ambitious and binding and fairly distributed manner with accountability mechanisms, penalties, so that Donald Trump couldn't just walk away as he did in June 2017 without punishment. Secondly, that this should be a process to transition out of carbon-addicted economies in not just energy and transport, tourism, agriculture, urbanization, production, consumption, disposal systems. All of these facets of daily life need transforming and decarbonization, but with workers' interests, community interests first, and empowerment strategies where gender, race, indigenous, global south, and youth constituencies can be respected with rights of nature, the rights of climate refugees, the rights of future generations, all built in. We mandated also the avoidance of false solutions. You know, we've got so many tech fixes and dangerous strategies like return to nuclear. And we needed to have climate-friendly technologies shifted to the global south, solar, wind, and others, without the intellectual property restrictions, and to bring in the military, the maritime, and the air transport sectoral emissions. We needed to leave the fossil fuels underground to compel the owners or the managers to seize new exploration and to revalue these unburnable carbon assets as stranded and end the state subsidies of fossil fuels, about $6 trillion. And I'll focus now on this, the financing, the need for more judicious carbon taxation, not like in Paris or Quito, which led to big riots in 2018 and 19. And to get rid of the carbon trading that's failed and to acknowledge a climate debt. So let me delve into those. But because none of those mandates were respected by the negotiators, mainly because of Barack Obama's State Department, then led by John Kerry, and a key negotiator, Todd Stern. So they just wouldn't have any of those. And as a result, as James Hansen, the great climate scientist, summarized, Paris Climate Agreement, fraud, a fake, just bullshit, right? Scientific analysis. And as Greta Thunberg said last month, it's really in the COP's blah, blah, blah. And, you know, Italian environment minister actually had to agree, yeah, you know, she's raised a serious problem, right? We were not credible in the past, or I would say the present. And one reason is because of the tricks, the accounting gimmicks, right? The so-called pledges for net zero, which are based on cheating tactics, which got us into this mess in the first place. I think she's really nailed it. So who is owing a climate debt as one of these big questions? Because polluter pays is a central, message, Environmental Economics 101, that's been explicitly avoided by the big polluters historically. And they are, of course, the United States and Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada as the big five of the Western powers. But there's also this new sort of network, I'll just call it the BRICS. They are called the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa bloc, and add Indonesia and a few others. But the BRICS, we had last week a People's BRICS Forum. You can go to the website and see some of the discussions about how we can get a bottom-up critique from the BRICS countries, like this one, and insist that reparations be paid not only by the imperialists, but the sub-imperialist polluters, to use the phrase of the Brazilian Rui Mauro Marini. And here's a picture of the sub-imperialism. This is the critical meeting where the Kyoto Protocol was destroyed as Barack Obama found himself in the room. First, it was Jacob Zuma, South Africa's president, Lula da Silva from Brazil, Wen Jiabao from China, Manmohan Singh from India, and Obama, because he had the National Security Agency spying on the phones of these leaders, he walked right in, and they agreed on an unambitious, non-binding system, no penalties. They call it bottom-up, voluntary system with nationally determined contributions. In essence, this was a league of super polluters who blew up the United Nations, as Bill McKibben put it. Okay, easy to blame the lead climate imperialists. But as Lumumba Diaping, who was leading the G77 plus China coalition, made sure we understood a suicide pact, certainly what will Obama tell his daughters about their Kenyan relatives' lives? What are they worth? But also, African members who were there were bought off by the industrial countries. They'd been lazy, and particularly South Africa, which had actively disrupted the unity of this G77 bloc that the then ambassador from Sudan, Lumumba Diaping, was trying to organize. So a very clear alignment of those interests between the imperial and sub-imperial. And South Africa was rewarded in 2011 by hosting the COP17, where again, US interests were paramount, as we learned from Todd Stern's emails to Hillary Clinton. And in a sense, now we have a real strong bloc of imperial and sub-imperial. Of G20 is their favorite gathering place, where their interests of the companies that put them into power in the industrial and the fossil fuel sectors are just to keep the emissions going as long as they can. And also to ignore this factor, the debt. Each US citizen, if you calculate the cost, the damage done at $40 a ton, social cost of carbon, it's $12,000 per person. Germany at 11,000, Canada at 10,800, and Australia at 10,000. So these are some of the major per capita climate debtor countries I want to highlight now. Now, I've used the figure that I've just found online from, I don't know, Our World in Data, wherever I found this. But actually, this is an incredible underestimate, because last month we got new data from scientists who did much more sophisticated modeling and looked forward, looked at feedback effects, looked at inequality and mortality. The social cost of carbon really we should be using is $3,000 per ton. Now, if we apply that to our South African climate debt that accumulates each year we're doing about 500 megatons. That's 3.3 times the output of our economy. So now we're talking big money. It's serious. And it's so serious that some people think you can make big profits from climate finance. The whole of the financial system should be supporting the transition, says the former Bank of England and Canadian central banker Mark Carney. And he's got a Glasgow financial alliance, and he's got 87 asset managers with 37 trillion in assets and 42 banksters with 30 trillion. And you can go on, and now we're talking real money here with a net zero banking alliance. But the most important thing is the money is there because it's profitable, right? So what kind of profit are we talking about? Well, unfortunately, the profits definitely are there because the likes of oil and coal and gas are through the roof. In other words, capitalism is sending not the signals Carney thinks, which is to make this transition, but the exact opposite. Keep investing in fossil fuels. And if you put on a price of carbon, as all these countries you see in this map down on the bottom right are trying to do in different ways, carbon taxes, carbon markets, offset schemes, it's covering about 22%, but is it anywhere near the $3,000 per ton? The highest price is Sweden at 130. South Africa is less than 50 US cents per ton. That's the carbon tax we have in this country. So nobody's serious. It's totally tokenistic, right? So what about trading, making profits from privatizing the air, selling the right to pollute? The European Union has done it most consistently and has a relatively high price, but it's important to understand why, because they've gone through these ups and downs. This is an incredibly speculative commodity, the right to pollute a ton of carbon. It's gone from 35 years a ton in 2006, down in 2007, down to 15, and up again to, 33 in 2008, and down to 7, and then down to 3. And you see, it's come up again since 2018 with a little bit of EU state regulation, but also look at this factor in 2020, the massive increase in quantitative easing-based finance. And this means our carbon markets end up being very closely correlated in 2008 and now April 2020 with the big lockdown crash. You see what happened to the carbon markets, you see what happened to the Dow Jones as just one of the examples in this period, right? A correlation between emissions trading and stock market speculation that I think we should be much more aware of when people are saying, oh, we can trade our way to price carbon and let the highest emitter pay a higher price, and that'll transfer the money. It'll be an efficient system. It can't be efficient when in 2021, we're getting so much money into these stock markets. We have a financialization problem. This problem hopefully is no longer with us, a climate denialism in the main emitting country, historically the US. But this is still where I insist we put more pressure on the Yankees, that is climate debt denialism. We recognize our historic role in putting emissions in the atmosphere that are up there, says Todd Stern, the State Department negotiator. But the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I just categorically reject that. How's that for a scofflaw, right? We've got to shame this logic, which continues with John Kerry. And now we look at the losers. Who should be paid? Well, these are what we're expecting, but let's just look at what happened in the last 20 years. It was Puerto Rico, Myanmar, Burma, Haiti, Philippines, Mozambique. So I live next to Mozambique. And let me just dwell a moment on that case. But just to make sure that you're aware, if you're climate damaged in the north, according to Christian Aid, you've got probably 60% of your losses covered in the private insurance markets. In the south, 4%. So we go to a place like Mozambique, massive loss and damage from cyclones in 2019. Cyclone Idai in March, Cyclone Kenneth, I'll tell you about in April. And second, there needs to be investments in adaptation resilience and making these areas climate proof. And third, we have to compensate very poor countries with very low emissions for the unutilized carbon space. So this would be the fair way to consider what are the reparations needed. Now, this is what happened in the second biggest city, 90% of it destroyed by Cyclone Idai. And Cyclone Kenneth came in just a month after, a bit further north, in a place where they're now looking for gas in the fourth largest oil field. So it's a set of crises, including an Islamic rebellion and major, including US, but major European and regional African military intervention. What should have happened when Cyclone Idai hit, it went into Zimbabwe. The Center for Natural Resource Governance said, we have a crisis here. We had more than 400 deaths in Zimbabwe, 1,000 more in Mozambique and Malawi. So rich countries should pay their climate debt. But here's the interesting nuance that I think we should also be aware of. We're not really trusting some of the governments, like the Zimbabwe government. Robert Mugabe, and then later Emerson Mnangagwa, has not really had the trust of the masses, including the finance minister, Ntuli Ncube. And so they've asked that the money for emergency relief be invested in civil society organizations, but also in a way that I think could persuade even Germans who watch this great little film, The Bill, that they can pay a climate debt. Very quickly, two quick cases, Yasuni in Ecuador, but first, in Namibia, could you pay the climate debt that some of you in this room owe, I certainly do, in a way that would be direct to the beneficiaries of areas affected by a climate catastrophe? This was what was tried in Namibia, next door to South Africa, but about an hour to the east of Windhoek, the capital. Women-headed households mainly got these. It was about $10 per month per person, and massive increases in all of these social benefits from just this simple pilot project for a basic income grant, rerouted directly to people through payment systems that weren't controlled by government, where you have a corrupt government, as in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and fortunately this one too. Yasuni is the other case where climate debt's been demanded to leave fossil fuels underground. The Quechua people in the Yasuni National Park area, their solidarity allies in Quito, eco-feminists at Acción Ecológica, CONAI, the indigenous movement, all pushing very hard. They didn't win because the Europeans failed to recognize their climate debt, but I think this is this future of solidarity where it will involve the kind of investment and finance links. So if you recall, we got rid of apartheid through local protest here, but it was augmented and amplified brilliantly through divestment movements, which then basically made it too expensive for white capital to still support the white racist Afrikaner regime. So they split and apartheid was ended. This is happening with fossil fuels, with $14 trillion now in investment pools that have committed to divest. Even one of this really key sites of ruling class ideology and financial power, Harvard even has just divested. Now, we need much more from below, an awareness of what's happening. It's really in the spirit that Manuel said, people fighting against extractivism, blockadia, much of that fossil fuel. The head of Anglo-American acknowledged it was $25 billion of projects that were stopped at that point. And you can map them on this continent, very close correlations between conflicts, including social movements and protests, right to say no, the kind of El Salvador story, we haven't got there yet, that Manuel was describing. But we did get one great victory last year, which was Lamu, Kenya, where the activists there in the Save Lamu coalition were able to persuade the Chinese even not to invest in a major coal-fired power plant. But let me wrap up. I mean, we have a wonderful atlas that identifies some of these blockadia struggles, ejatlas.org. And here are some books I've written about these kinds of struggles, strategies, tactics, where, as I say, the basic principle is make the polluters pay, leave the oil and gas underground, make sure reparations and climate debt are on the agenda. I hope you'll join us in that, dear comrades. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Well, we have a lot there to chew on from our four panelists. And so I want to open the floor for discussion among the panelists, as well as questions from viewers. Some of you are on YouTube and you don't have any direct way of getting a question to us, but what you need to do is send an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. That's me. I'll monitor that and pass your question on to our panelists. Let's open the floor now. Are there any comments or questions that any of our panelists want to present to one another?
We can see Compañero Barkin, his hand is up. David, do you have a video for us?
Let me put this on gallery view so I can see folks. Yeah, David Barkin, welcome. Welcome back.
Oh, hello, I'll actually turn on my video. I would like to celebrate the initial mention of the problem of the oceans. I think that it's an extraordinary problem, and I think that it's almost impossible to underestimate the severity and the depths of what the lack of serious oversight by the International Ocean Mining Association. Paul, I'm getting that name wrong.
The International Seabed Authority, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the extraordinary capture of that organization by the mining companies themselves is extraordinary. And the example of Nauru is one of the worst examples of the way in which a country is taking short-term advantage and in its own benefit, but really in collaboration with its corporate partners. Lucia and Manuel's description of another way of the corporate capture is really another example of the way in which the international system just is unmanageable. And I believe, and I throw this out as a question, I think that it's unreformable. I think that within the current constellation of the United Nations and the World Bank, the international financial and development organizations, I think that it's absolutely impossible to reform that. And the only way to get around that is to just declare it not relevant by countries, as I believe, Lucia, you were describing with the present case of Australia. And so what are we left with? I think we're left with the kind of activism that Patrick is suggesting, and a real and a profound necessity to do the kind of propaganda and information that mobilizes vast contingents of people. Here in Mexico, right now, you have lots of information now about individual communities, thousands of individual communities all over the world that are reacting against the incursion of mining corporation, and agro-extractivism of lots of different forms. The four of you didn't even mention, well, it's perhaps going beyond it, what's going on in Africa with AGRA, and the way in which the Gates Foundation and the international agricultural research community is trying to, no, is not trying, has been spending 10 years reinventing the green revolution to impoverish community farmers throughout Africa. So you have, it doesn't matter where you go, you have case studies incredibly dispersed all over the world that are impoverishing people and destroying the replicability of nature. I'll quit there.
Okay, David has highlighted the corporate takeover of global governance and of states as well in their own interests. Do any of our panelists want to pick up on that?
Yeah,
Lucia.
Yeah, thank you. Just to go to that last part of reforms or no reforms, yes, there are like two kind of tendencies of countries, institutions, academics who, defend reform. I'm talking about trade and investment, who defend the structural reforms, which actually have to do with basically ending the system. So stepping out of exit convention, for example, or withdrawing from treaties. And this actually has been already the case in, we saw Ecuador exited the exit, but now it's signed back in. But, Venezuela and Bolivia also have terminated some of their agreements or exited exit. And there are also some interesting cases in South Africa, India, Tanzania, and Indonesia. I think those are the most interesting cases. But of course, on the other side, there is, big lobby groups, and especially from the arbitration industry, but also big investors who want to keep the system as it is. And they're just proposing like very marginal reforms. So this only have to do with changing small parts of the process of how it works, but they're not going to the core of the issue, which is, why do we have to give these privileges to foreign investors, especially, the ones that are the polluters. And this, of course, is, backed up by the USA, EU, Canada, China, etc. So these are the big powers too, right? So I just wanted to add that to the reform part. And like me personally, while I was listening to Patrick also, I was, like you were saying a lot about who pollutes, who has to pay, who has to be compensated, all these issues. And what we were also trying to show here is that as long as there are these investment agreements in place, the ones that are going to be compensated for sure are going to be these big companies, big corporations. So I think that's a topic that, you know, maybe should be more brought to the conversations when we just talk about this, which is why in general do they have to be compensated? And these discussions are just not happening in UNCTAD or any type of, you know, meeting when they talk about reform of the system. So I think that's something that just needs to probably be more politicized somehow.
I completely agree, and I would take that further, Lucia, because too often those who would reform global trade, especially investment through, you might have heard of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, where the basic theory is if you shine a spotlight on these corrupt relationships, they will be disinfected. This is the George Soros kind of network. And what I've been trying to get, let's say, a handle on is how much we can really measure unequal ecological exchange exactly to jujitsu, that attempt to cleanse, to reform these relationships through market and, let's say, transparency orientations. Turns out if you study the depletion of wealth, which is never included, it's not in GDP, depleted wealth is just, you know, a nullity, and all you do is you count your income. And at that point, you get into quite radical discussions about whether it's in the interests of sovereign countries and their people to continue extracting through multinational corporates. So if you've ever heard of unequal ecological exchange, I've written a recent essay on it at CADTM, and the depletion of non-renewable resources, which to me is a killer on anyone trying to argue for foreign direct investment in the extractive industries. But I think more generally what David's saying is maybe we need that fix it or nix it debate again. And in the WTO debates, I remember from particularly Manuel from the 1980s, the question was whether you could do anything for working class power to, let's say, rejig this. And I just asked the panel if you've thought about putting a carbon tax on trade to disincentivize long distance trade, shipping, air transport. That is a carbon tax on the transport, which has been ignored so far, plus a tax, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM it's called, which will apply to high carbon intensive products like everything from this country where 85% of our electricity is coal fired. Now that to me is a fascinating route to the, do you remember Samir Amin? He died 3 years ago, or Walden Bello, running now for vice president, TNI and IPS. And they've argued for a deglobalization, a delinking, which would then recognize the need to relink and localize and to have a more coherent local economic strategy. And I think actually it's worth our discussing whether a European Union imperialist protectionist CBAM, and no doubt the US and UK will pick it up. It starts in 2023, by the way. Can we start to say, well, if you're getting revenues from that, you owe the climate reparations for this huge debt you've acquired over time. You might as well start some down payments with that revenue stream. And that would help our struggles against the high carb and pollution intensive, heavy industries and mining and smelting and all the rest. I don't know, what do you think? Is this part of our non-reformist reforms, to quote Andre Gortz, that would jujitsu the system? And in a way that IPS was exploring back in the 1980s with putting labor provisions on international trade agreements, working very carefully with activists in South Africa that wanted sanctions and in Chile as well. What do you think? Should we start to work on the left with the imperialist protectionists for some sort of carbon pricing that would incentivize localization? I'm quite open to that. What do you comrades think?
My only
Manuel?
that, Patrick, is that how much carbon border adjustment tax mechanisms, instead of disincentivizing, would actually end up justifying or serve as a minimum, requirement that corporations could kind of greenwash themselves with, you know what I mean, with paying a minimum tax that would actually serve them to justify the increase of their exports.
Yes, well, I mean, well from Washington, the Trump paleocon agenda is exactly to put on these kinds of protectionist, measures to justify, to make themselves look better in competition with more competitive, Chinese investors, traders. And I think that's part of the danger, right? That we don't want to see a Smoot-Hawley 1930s. But on the other hand, some sort of move towards a localization approach because it's smart from a climate perspective as well as local sovereignty. It's potentially on the agenda for us, and it will start actually in 2023, and South Africa is going to have to adapt.
Yeah, just to complete my comment, I think that the real issue is, I think the last time I saw you, David, it was at the Degrowth conference in Leipzig. Very nice to see you here, David. And this Degrowth conference, I wonder, I haven't followed it, what has happened to it, if it's continuing or not. I personally went more into the, or being more supportive, not so much by the Heinrich Böll, but by other foundations. But I remember the Heinrich Böll was very much on the Degrowth conference, supporting the Degrowth conference. So this concept of degrowth is as important as the localization, right, Patrick? And I think from our perspective, Lucia's and I, on trade and investment, I think the most important point we have to make is why is it so important to attract foreign direct investment, right? How to debunk that myth, and also the myth that with free trade agreements you are actually attracting more free trade, more foreign direct investment. In one country that is important to see is Brazil. Despite Bolsonaro craziness and everything, I think Brazil hasn't moved from a bilateral investment model that does not have all the crazy clauses that free trade agreements have, like indirect expropriation, an ISDS, and all that. So Brazil still sticks to a little bit of what could still be seen as a little bit of light of the BRICS, because as Lucia said, India, South Africa, and also Indonesia are denouncing their bilateral investment treaties. And Brazil is a country that does not have free trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties. So I don't know, the point I think I want to make is that how these big countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, can still be examples of a detachment from the neoliberal model based on, based on these treaties. I don't know if that makes sense.
By the way, in December, we will have a webinar on degrowth coming up. So we'll have a more extensive discussion of that then. But I wanted to throw a question back to Paul that David had raised at the beginning of his comments, and that is in the oceans, the mining of the ocean bottom, which of course is territory that lies outside of the jurisdiction of states, but comes under UN jurisdiction. And David was suggesting that that corporate mining interests have basically driven policies in that area. What can you tell us about that, Paul?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cliff. There are a couple of things that I would say there. One is historically, the high seas have mostly been a no man's land. It's sort of wild, do what you want. The one weak exception, and I do say weak, is the seabed itself, because there is this International Seabed Authority, which has some capacity to limit what happens. But having said that, I think David's comments are quite right, that the ISA has been very much pro-development, pro-industry. And the other piece of it that many of this audience may not be so familiar with is that the activities we're talking about are in the deep ocean, and the environmental impact there is likely to be very severe and very rapid, with extremely long recovery trajectories. And so when we damage the coastal environment, there's a reasonable chance, if it's a small enough scale, that recovery can happen in a reasonable period of time. In the deep ocean, we don't even know how long those recoveries could be. It could be many hundreds, even thousands of years once you go in there and start mining, for example. So it raises a second point, given that many of this panel are economically and governance focused in their thinking. And that's, how do you value that sort of environment and the destruction of that sort of environment, given that, in any of our lifetimes, or even our grandchildren, great-grandchildren's lifetimes, that damage may not be rectified. It may not ever be, including complete species extinction. So how do you deal with that in this world of ours that's economically driven? So I'd throw that as a question to some of my fellow panelists.
Let me just link a couple things here. Corporations shaping ocean bottom mining, corporations driving the ISDS, investor-state dispute settlements, which is a kind of global judicial system that operates to protect corporate interests. I think what we're seeing in so many domains is the result of corporate globalization, transnational corporations exerting power over states who are compromising, if not losing, their sovereignty in many respects, but also the corporations establishing control over international bodies that are increasingly representing their interests. Aren't we seeing emerge a kind of proto-corporate global governance structure?
Well, yes, although, I mean, there are holes, and one of them that gives me continual hope was to find a break on what in this country 20 years ago was probably the most important struggle against international corporate power, and that was on AIDS. And just, if you'll remember, AIDS medicines cost $10,000 a year. Big pharma corps, few of them had major, kind of monopolistic grip on through a trade-related intellectual property system. So there's a combination of technical arguments on behalf of public goods, merit goods, technical arguments, bureaucrats like, but really it was protest. It was protest in the US by ACT UP. It was protest by Médecins Sans Frontières and Oxfam. And it was particularly protest in this country by a treatment action campaign that really raised the morality of the big pharma corps profiteering. When we did get rid of that in 2001 and generic AIDS medicines were provided, about 7 million people get them now. And our life expectancy went from 52 to 64, just in this country, with similar impressive outcomes elsewhere. So we do have actually one wonderful case where we could say the corporates were defeated, the globalization of capital was pushed back by the globalization of people. And I think to answer where Paul wants to go, which is there's a lot of externalities from corporates. And I always liked Emmanuel Wallerstein, who said, Patrick, you've got to finally take these liberals seriously from their own rhetorical standpoint and call them on it, which is what I've been trying to do a little bit, as I said, with climate debt. Polluter pays is a very simple, environmental economics principle. It's like, the most essential one. And when they absolutely refuse to acknowledge that, it does, I think, provide the grounds for their delegitimization, which is why I think the UNFCCC should be in that category, fix it or nix it, because I think we're all very fed up with the failure on those 6 grounds I said to actually do anything. And it does represent a point where, well, we have to do it from below. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, really coined that phrase blockadia, but it's been going on for decades. And we've seen many of these amazing stories, like the El Salvador one. Colombia has the biggest gold mine in the world. La Colossus was beat back, Anglo-American there. And there's so many great stories. And the question, can we link up this movement and actually make the kind of change that our global leaders won't, until we can change the balance of forces, get some national leaders into power who will take climate seriously.
Um,
Can I just add also something, Cliff? Yeah.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to, I do like your conclusion of this, big corporate global law that's happening. But I think that states are also a big problem of this. I mean, we're not trying to say that if there are no investment agreements in place, then everything is going to be perfect, because of course, I don't think there's any state actually really talking about degrowth or localizing our economies or stop depending from big, global supply chains. So those conversations are not happening in the state level. And yeah, so that's kind of like the issue, right? Like we can't talk about changing the supplier, but not the model. So yeah, so when where do those conversations have to take part is what I don't know, because I don't know if those conversations need to take part when we're talking about reforming trade agreements, or those conversations are part of major economic decisions of how do we want our countries or states to function. And as long as once there is probably a state that it's going to be talking about degrowth and localizing economies, then these trade agreements are not going to make any sense. But that's not happening now. So at least what Manuel and me are trying to do is to eliminate these big obstacles so those conversations can happen. When they happen, there's no ISDS in place to make sure that there's compensation going on. So that's kind of like how I see it sometimes.
Well, it's interesting though. States are not irrelevant even in a globalized world. They are really quite constrained as to what they can do effectively. And that's illustrated by what is happening now with the rise in gasoline prices in the United States. President Biden, who has promised a climate-centric, climate-focused administration, is now urging countries to increase their petroleum production in order to be able to bring down the cost of gasoline to consumers. And so, it's an interesting contradiction, professing one set of principles, but having to act really in behalf of corporate capital. I see Metsu Louis has joined us. She was on YouTube and had a question that she sent, but now that you're in the Zoom room, you can present your question directly. And then after that, Jerry Harris has a question. Mitsu, will you unmute? And let us see you too. Are you there?
May I say something in the meantime while Misu connects?
Okay, yes.
Well, it's an advertisement, but this is John Cabana and Robbins wrote book called The Water Defenders. It's all about the history of the struggle in El Salvador. It's a fantastic book that will be published soon in Spanish by Grano de Sal, a Mexican publisher. So we're very happy with this, having this storytelling story of the work in El Salvador is super important, and I'm sure all of you here would really like to read it. So sorry for the ad.
That's okay.
An important book. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Metsu's made her way in.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I was just on Manuel's comment about the victory with the Pacific Rim company in Ecuador, and just to do a bit more description of how that solidarity effort was able to win against company. Thanks. Oh, and if there are other like very strategic cases that you think would be ones that activists should focus on?
Welcome, Miss Sue, and it's very nice to see you not in person, but in video at least, at last. And I know we have many conversations pending. I think that, well, this book again tells the story about how international, well, first of all, local, then national, and then international struggle became such a story of success, right? And how it actually pressured the centers of power here in Washington, and also how it wasn't the decision of the legislature in El Salvador to ban mining in the country because of the incredible hydric stress or the lack of water in the country. It wasn't a left or right story. It was a story of people really realizing the future disaster, the calamitous disaster, proximity that was coming on, right? So it's not left versus right, but yeah, I mean, the nature of the story is great. And one story that I think is very important, because it was mentioned here about the mining in the seabeds, is one that is just coming out very public, which is the US company Odyssey Marine suing Mexico for $3.5 billion because of the negation of a permit to mine off the coast of Baja California, a very fragile zone, obviously for the animals and turtles and the whole. It's actually the miners, not sorry, the miners, the fishermen and fisherwomen, the fisher people that have resisted the seabed mining in Baja California. And US Odyssey is suing Mexico for $3.5 billion. It is incredible how much lack of awareness there is about this particular case. And CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law, just published, and I will share that they're gonna introduce an amicus curiae at the World Bank's ICSID. The amicus curiae's purpose is to bring in the opinions and the voices of the population of the port of the seaports in Baja California and the fisher people. But this amicus curiae is completely at the discretion of the tribunal if they want to hear it or not. And more than not, they reject them, the amicus curiae. The only parties they hear are the corporations with their alleged breaches of clauses on the free trade agreements. So this is one case that I hope we all can follow, and we can make a real campaign like the one we did with El Salvador, that demonstrates the tremendous imbalance between I just wrote in La Jornada today, if you want to see it, I put the link there, what the imbalance between what I call hard law, there's a school of thought about the imbalance of hard law and soft law for human rights and hard law for corporations. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Lucia, as well.
Okay, we're going to have to end soon, and I see that Lucia is going to be leaving us shortly. But let's go for our last question to Jerry Harris.
I wanted to raise something that we haven't talked about, which is the danger of eco-fascism. And I think the World Bank's predicting about 150 million climate refugees by 2050, perhaps 300 million by 2100. And given the the incredible racist and xenophobic movement in the United States, in the UE, around refugees already, which is about 60 or 70 million refugees in the world, I really fear that the climate refugee crisis will be like rocket fuel for reactionary nationalism and fascist movements. Not only immigration across borders, but migration within countries too. So, for example, the Dust Bowl crisis during the Great Depression in the US, which millions of people from Oklahoma and Texas and other states went out to California and faced really severe repression and caused a lot of class struggle, as in the great novel Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck talked about. So I was wondering how we could prepare ourselves for this reactionary political movement getting stronger. How, you know, I've been listening to all these great stories about struggles taking place, but this problem really scares me quite a bit, and so I'm wondering if people, am I being paranoid, or is this something we have to prepare for?
Okay,
Liv, just to say I have to leave. Thank you very much for the invitation. And to this last comment, I'm just going to share something that we also just published in TNI that has to do with exactly how, you know, security is increasing to to tackle climate change. So I do think that there's a militarization of a solution towards climate change and migration and everything. But I'm just going to share the link in the chat. And thank you very much. And I'm sorry I have to, yeah, I'm leaving now, but.
Lucia.
well, thank you,
Thanks.
Lucia,
Gracias,
for
Lucia.
joining us.
And maybe I'll just very quickly say, I think for Jerry, there may be one case. It's in Georgia. Clarkston, I believe, is the name of a town that's been a sort of haven, a refuge welcoming site for climate refugees from Central America. Look, I think what you're saying is terribly important. The Syrian refugees are sometimes attributed to the drought in 2010, 11 that led to many people moving into the cities just when neoliberalism was hitting, and then part of the uprising, the Arab Spring, the North African uprising. And then with the catastrophic attacks on them, moving to Europe. So part of our narrative should be, certainly in my country here, we've had from southern Matabeleland, Zimbabwe, people who've spoken and been able to cross the border easily for decades. A similar language to Zulu. So when they come to Durban, these refugees from drying soils, really climate refugees, then can sometimes fit in, but there's also, you know, climate refugee xenophobia. And we haven't yet done the right kind of popular education to say, actually, we in South Africa, the global north of Africa, the sub-imperial power, are actually part and parcel of the reason for these refugee streams. We've had similar problems with the ability to communicate to prevent xenophobia against Congolese refugees from the eastern side, where we get our coltan, where South African companies go working with warlords, and 5 million people have died and many have come to South Africa. So I think this is part of a bigger problem, and raising climate and demanding, especially resources, so that a climate debt can potentially be paid to give a basic income grant to allow people to survive, so they aren't necessarily, you know, having to be refugees, would be a first prize. I hope we can all work on that. And it really does entail calling these neoliberal liberals, the John Kerrys and Bidens and the likes of Jonathan Pershing, who took over from Todd Stern, really calling them on their hypocrisy, that if polluter pays is a central element in managing the environment. We academics call this ecological modernization. And these bastards are saying, we don't owe. We know we put it up there, but we just categorically reject it. It's really up to those of you in the US and Canada. You know, we've had so much of the America first, the Canada first on vaccines, right? Where you've got 5 times as many as you have citizens. And Africa is about 4% vaccinated. And this could be one of those breakpoints where hopefully the solidarity, not just the sympathy, but the sense that we are all acting in our mutual self-interest, has to kick in now. So as your delegates go to Glasgow, give them hell on what they owe the rest of the world, so we can disincentivize more of these emissions. Thanks, comrades.
Okay,
And can I just say, our slogan here, you'll all appreciate, Amandla, power, away to the people. Amandla, away to. Thanks to our comrades at Center for Global Justice.
thank you, Patrick. Do either of our other panelists have any final words? Okay, well, with that, I want to thank all of our panelists for very informative presentations, and call your attention to the fact that this webinar, as well as past ones, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, globaljusticecenter.org. On Wednesday, we have a special extra webinar. This will be on the case of Steve Donziger, the lawyer who has been battling Chevron to win compensation to the indigenous people of Ecuador for the destruction of their environment that Chevron and its predecessor Texaco visited. It is a case that has been going on for many years now, and Chevron has fought back against Donziger viciously. In fact, he has been under house arrest and is now facing imprisonment. I understand a hearing on that is scheduled for tomorrow. So hopefully he will join us on Wednesday, unless he's in prison, for this webinar about Donziger struggle and the Ecuadorian people's struggle against Chevron. So that's Wednesday at 1 o'clock, our usual time. And then next Monday, we will have a webinar marking the opening of the of COP26 on climate activism. So hope to see you again for that. And now let me close by thanking our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off for today. Ciao.